if it is wrong to eat blood, what about blood transfusions?
Diane, that's definitely in your category, but I will add before you answer, I have never preached on a subject, with few exceptions, that's raised the ire, the anger of so many pastors by talking about the life is in the blood. And some of them have got a medical background, actually hate this Bible verse because they have a group out there who says we won't take blood transfusions, we'll let our kids die. And you've got the others who want a bloodless religion and they want to talk only about nice things. So from both of those ends, I've had opposition if I preach the sort of thing that you've heard tonight. But Diane, you've been a medical background. What do you have to say about this sort of area?
Well, this giving a blood transfusion is not actually eating the blood. It's putting the blood where it belongs, which is back into the blood circulation. You put the blood into a vein and it goes back into the circulation. And it is done in order to save people's lives, not to take them. And you don't actually have to kill the blood donor in order to get the blood.
Unless something went wrong.
Well, having both given blood and then received some blood after I had an operation where I did need to be given some blood in order to recover from that operation.
Glenn, you made an interesting comment before we started about the eating of pork and blood transfusions. It's maybe a little bit out on left wing, but I think it's interesting for people to hear that.
Well, I've been I was, before we moved to Tennessee, a regular blood donor, giving blood, on a regular basis, but also platelets, which I didn't like. But in graduate school, I was a regular giver of plasma because I was a starving student. I could get $25 a week. And that was a lot of money in the 70s, I guess that was. But to give plasma, they take the blood out, they send it to the back lab, they spin it in a centrifuge to remove the plasma, then they put the fluid back in. One thing, it would be freezing cold when you do that because the refrigerator, the centrifuge, is in a cold room. But they would preach to us about, do not eat pork. If you eat pork, do not come in here. You can't give blood. And that became very clear. Even though I do eat pork every once in a while, it really scared me because occasionally someone would come in off the street wanting a little money, most likely for not the best of purposes. And there's a little filter on your blood, and there's filters would just clog up. And I would be laying in the bed next to him looking at it. It would just be this opaque, just fat. And the nurses would just chew them out. You've been eating pork. No, I haven't. Yes, you have. Well, that was a week ago. I don't care. You can't eat pork and give blood because it clogged the filters up. Well, that was eye-opening to me that there's a reason in Leviticus that they were warned about eating pigs. And you see it if you give plasma.
That's one reason I would never make a good Jew. I delight in pork, but in reality, when we have a look at the rules of giving of what to eat, Diane, would you comment on the Acts chapter 17 instruction there? Because you've got a good article on the Ask site. So tell them about the Ask site, tell them about the fact file, and tell them a summary of what Paul does in Acts 17.
Well, Acts 17 was when the disciples met together, because by the time you got to Acts 17, quite a number of non-Jews had become Christians. And so there was some confusion as to what instruction should be given to these people who were not brought up with God's rules about what you could and couldn't eat, because people who weren't Jews could and did eat anything. Or whatever was available in the local community that they lived in. And so people did ask, well, how much of the Jewish rules about how to live and what to eat do the Gentiles need to follow? And the disciples met and talked about that. And Peter had an interesting experience about that when he was directed by God to go and preach to some non-Jews in the house of Cornelius. And they obviously knew the Bible history going back to before there were any Jews. So going back to when the entire human race consisted only of Noah and his family. And what was Noah and his family instructed to eat? Well, they were told they could eat meat, they could eat flesh. But notice in Genesis 9, when God gives out those instructions, he doesn't say what kind of flesh they could eat and whether there were any kinds of flesh or animal foods that were restricted. Basically, anything that could move. So if you could kill it and catch it, you were entitled to eat it. But God was quite clear, you could not eat the blood. The life was in the blood. So therefore, in Acts 17, the disciples considered, well, what do we teach the Gentiles? The Gentiles are not Jews, therefore they are not bound by those sort of rules, but they are still bound by God's rules. And God's rules go all the way back to, well, they go back to the beginning, but this is a rule that applied to the entire human race. So it still applies to the Gentiles. And so they wrote to the Gentiles and said, yes, you may eat anything. You don't have to restrict yourself to the Jewish rules, but you must not eat the blood of strangled animals. Now that means an animal that has been killed by having its neck wrung, but not with the blood drained out. And if you read the instructions in the book of Leviticus, where it's all set out much more clearly and more detailed, you had to cut open the animal and drain out the blood. And that way you could avoid eating the blood, but still are able to eat the animal flesh. So the Gentiles were told, yes, you may eat whatever animals there are, but you must not eat the blood. So that rule does not only apply to Jews, it applies to everyone. And it's never been rescinded, that in the rest of the New Testament. And that's important for us to remember as well.
Yeah. That the important thing here, Diane, is do you accept God's right to make the rules? Right? Now, that's where we started, and that's where we will continue on. God gave Noah a rule. The world had changed, the weather had changed, and God changed the rules for food, and he had every right. He could have given Adam that rule if he wanted to, but there's a theological purpose here associated with blood.